Today, we're ranking every major submachine gun of the Second World War, from the crude stamped tubes that jammed at the worst possible moment, to the legendary weapon that armed millions of Soviet soldiers and helped take Berlin. D tier, the worst. The submachine guns that failed the men carrying them. Rank 8. The Type 100, Japan. Let's start at the bottom. The Type 100 was Japan's primary submachine gun, and it tells you almost everything about why Japan was outgunned at close range throughout the Pacific War. Picture this. You are a Japanese soldier on Saipan in 1944. An American Marine is 20 meters away with a Thompson, throwing 45 caliber rounds at you at 700 rounds per minute. You raise your Type 100, chambered in the underpowered 8x22mm Nambu pistol cartridge, and you squeeze the trigger. 450 rounds per minute, a round that struggles to penetrate a wooden door at 50 meters. The Type 100 was issued in tiny numbers. Total wartime production was barely 28,000 units, compared to over 1 million Thompsons. The early variants had a bizarre folding bayonet lug, because Japanese doctrine still believed the bayonet charge was central to infantry combat. The magazine fed from the left side at an awkward angle. The sights were crude. Quality control collapsed by 1944, with late-war Type 100s suffering from rough welds, soft metal, and broken firing pins. Japan simply did not understand the submachine gun's role in modern infantry combat, and Japanese soldiers paid for that misunderstanding in every island assault from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Rank 7. The Beretta Model 38, Italy. Now this one will surprise people. The Beretta Model 38 was actually a well-engineered weapon. Smooth action, reliable, accurate. Italian gunsmiths at the Beretta works in Brescia knew what they were doing. So why is it in D tier? Because Italy never produced enough of them, never issued them widely, and never trained its infantry to use submachine guns as a doctrine. The Beretta 38 was a beautiful weapon issued to a handful of elite units, paratroopers, military police, and select assault formations. The average Italian infantryman went to war with a bolt-action Carcano, while the Germans, Soviets, and Americans were arming entire battalions with automatic weapons. The Beretta was the right gun in the wrong army. Italian quality, combined with Italian production numbers and Italian doctrine, meant a fine submachine gun that almost nobody actually carried into combat. A weapon that should have been legendary, reduced to a footnote because the country that built it never figured out how to use it. C tier. Bad tier. Decent weapons, flawed in execution. Rank 6. The Sten Gun, Britain. The Sten Gun is a controversial entry. To some, it is the weapon that armed the resistance and helped win the war. To others, it is the most dangerous submachine gun ever issued to a friendly force. Both are true. The Sten was Britain's emergency response to the fall of France in 1940. With the British Expeditionary Forces equipment abandoned on the beaches of Dunkirk, Britain needed a submachine gun, and it needed millions of them, and it needed them last week. The Sten was the answer. 68 parts, stamped steel, crude welding, designed to be built in any workshop with basic machine tools. It cost about £2 and 10 shillings to manufacture, roughly the price of a pair of good boots. Over 4 million were produced. The Sten worked. It fired 9mm parabellum rounds at 550 rounds per minute, the same cartridge as the German MP40. Resistance fighters across occupied Europe were armed with Stens, dropped by parachute. The British, Canadian, and Commonwealth armies carried them into every theater. But the Sten was also genuinely dangerous to its own user. The side-mounted magazine was the weak point of the design. A knock against the magazine, even a hard slap, could cause the bolt to jump forward and fire a round, or empty the entire magazine in an uncontrolled burst. Soldiers were killed by their own Stens dropping or being mishandled. The Sten earned the nickname Plumber's Nightmare from the troops who carried it. It worked, it armed the war, and it killed Allied soldiers along the way. Rank 5. The MAS-38, France. France's primary submachine gun, issued in small numbers before the fall of France in 1940, and continued in limited service throughout the war by Free French and Vichy forces. The MAS-38 was a competent weapon, reasonably reliable, accurate, manageable recoil, but it was chambered in the unusual 7.65mm French long pistol cartridge, a round used by almost nobody else, which made ammunition supply a constant problem. The MAS-38 had a clever folding wire stock and a downward curving magazine that gave it a distinctive silhouette. The downside was production. France lost most of its industrial capacity in 1940, and the MAS-38 was never produced in numbers that mattered. It served the French resistance and Free French units in North Africa and Italy, but its impact on the war was limited by the same problem that limited everything else French during the war. The country that designed it was occupied, and the factories that built it were repurposed by the Germans. B-tier, mid-tier, the reliable workhorses. Rank 4, the M3 grease gun, United States. America's answer to the Sten. By 1942, the United States Army had a problem. The Thompson submachine gun was excellent, but it was also expensive, slow to manufacture, and complicated. The Army needed something cheaper, faster, and simpler, in numbers measured in the millions. The M3 grease gun was the answer. Stamped steel, 45 caliber. Cyclic rate of around 450 rounds per minute, slow enough that a trained soldier could actually fire controlled bursts. Cost about $15 per unit, compared to over $200 for a Thompson. The grease gun looked, as its nickname suggested, like the mechanic's tool used to lubricate vehicles. American soldiers laughed at it on first issue. They stopped laughing after they fired it. The slow rate of fire made it more controllable than almost any other submachine gun of the war. The heavy 45 caliber round hit hard at close range. The simple blowback action was reliable in mud, sand, and snow. Around 600,000 grease guns were produced during the war. They served from Normandy to Korea to Vietnam and were still in limited U.S. service into the 1990s. Not pretty, not glamorous, just deeply, consistently effective. Rank 3, the MP40, Germany. The weapon that defined the image of the German soldier in popular culture. The MP40 was Germany's standard submachine gun from 1940 onward. Issued initially to paratroopers, vehicle crews, junior officers, and squad leaders. By the middle of the war, entire infantry units in elite formations were carrying them. The MP40 was a development of the earlier MP38, and the changes were all about production. Stamped steel construction, phenolic plastic and aluminium components, a folding metal stock that made it compact for paratroopers and vehicle crews, cyclic rate of around 500 rounds per minute, 9mm parabellum, 32 round box magazine. The MP40 was reliable, accurate at close range, and relatively easy to control. German soldiers loved it. American and British soldiers who captured them often kept them as personal weapons. Its weakness was the magazine. The single-feed design was prone to jamming with grit and dust. The cyclic rate, while controllable, was slower than the Soviet competition we are about to discuss, and the 32-round capacity meant frequent reloads in sustained firefights. Total wartime production was around 1 million units, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to the number at the top of this list. A masterpiece of German industrial design, in a war where the Soviets were about to redefine what mass production actually meant. A tier, the elite, rank 2, the Thompson M1A1, United States. Now we move into the rarefied air, the Thompson submachine gun, the gun that armed the gangsters of 1920s Chicago and the soldiers who liberated Europe. The Thompson M1A1 was the simplified wartime variant of the famous M1 1928, stripped of the Cutz compensator, the finned barrel, and the complex Blish lock action. What remained was a heavy, beautifully machined, devastatingly effective close-quarters weapon, 45 caliber, the same round as the Colt M1 1911 pistol. Cyclic rate of around 700 rounds per minute, 30-round box magazine, or the famous 50 and 100-round drum magazines used by some units early in the war. The Thompson weighed nearly 5 kilograms loaded, heavy by any standard, but the weight absorbed recoil and made it remarkably controllable in full automatic fire. American soldiers carried Thompsons in every theater, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea to the urban fighting of Manila. British commandos used them on raids across occupied Europe. Soviet units received them through Lend-Lease. Around 1.5 million Thompsons were produced during the war. Its weakness was simple. It was too expensive and too slow to manufacture. The 45 caliber round was heavy, limiting how much ammunition a soldier could carry. But for what it was, the Thompson was the finest close-quarters weapon ever issued to American forces, and arguably the most iconic submachine gun in human history. S tier. Legendary. The submachine gun that took Berlin. Rank 1. The PPSh-41, Soviet Union. And now we arrive at the top, the PPSh-41. Properly the Pistolet Pulemiot Shpagina, designed by Georgy Shpagin in 1940 and put into mass production after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The PPSh was the answer to a specific Soviet question. How do you arm millions of conscript soldiers with a close-quarters automatic weapon, fast, cheap, and good enough to fight the Germans in the streets of Stalingrad and the forests of Belarus? The answer was the PPSh-41. Stamped steel construction, wooden stock. 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev cartridge, a hot, fast round that hit harder than 9 mm parabellum at close range. Cyclic rate of around 900 rounds per minute, the fastest of any major submachine gun of the war. 71-round drum magazine, or 35-round box. Around 6 million PPSh-41s were produced during the war. 6 million. Entire Soviet infantry companies were armed with nothing but PPShs by 1943. German soldiers on the Eastern Front called the sound of the PPSh the Soviet sewing machine, because the cyclic rate was so high that individual shots blurred into a continuous mechanical hum. Captured PPShs were so valued by German troops that they were rechambered for 9 mm parabellum and reissued as the MP717R. The PPSh-41 was simple enough to manufacture in factories that had been bombed and rebuilt 3 times. It was reliable in mud, snow, and the freezing temperatures of the Eastern Front. It was carried up the steps of the Reichstag in May 1945. The PPSh earns the top tier the same way the Mosin Nagant earned its place on our rifle list. Not the most refined weapon of the war, but the one that armed the army that took Berlin. That is the ranking. From the Type 100, a weapon designed for a doctrine that no longer made sense, to the PPSh-41, the submachine gun that wrote the ending of the war in Europe. If you enjoyed this video, the one on screen now is for you. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments which submachine gun you would have ranked differently. We read every single one.